So I was watching a video, well, it was a reel on Instagram, and it was quite interesting because they're essentially referring to the idea of like power and how it dictates truth in some sense. Now, of course, there are multiple ways to look at it. I chose to look at it through like the lens of like politics and just social interaction, social dynamics, and making money, of course. So the idea here is this: the more power you have, the less truth starts to matter in some sense. Now, is the idea correct? On the one hand, it is. I mean, if you have all the power, you can technically maintain a lie. Now, the thought following that is, don't the lies, doesn't the truth, doesn't reason generally catch up to you eventually though? Don't you start to realize that you're living a delusion? And what you find is that that's not particularly the case. And the reason that's not the case is because of, if you don't pay attention to something, so for example, if you turn a blind eye to something, it's almost as if it doesn't exist. Now, let's look at this practically, right? You could technically assume that your management and your accumulation of wealth never harmed people. So let's say you're worth $1 billion and you are into cocoa farming or something like that, and you exploit child labor or whatever. You could turn a blind eye to that, right? And it would be very effective in the short run. Like, you'd be surprised at how much money could do, like how much protection it could buy, how much media coverage you could have, etc., etc., etc. All the works. But now here's a pattern I've observed. What you find is that the more you oppress people, the more you create pressure cookers. So the more lies you have to uphold, the more pressure there is. And if you're simply going to ignore that pressure, it's going to explode and it's going to look very terrible. Now, that leads me into the idea of, do the masses generally win? It's a yes and no. It's a issue of perception, because the masses technically overthrow new or old leaders, but then bring in a new one who just happens to be smarter and outmaneuvers them, making so that they get back into the same position just within a different variation. Now, of course, we do see a betterment in some sense. For example, back in the day, slavery was getting whipped. Now slavery is just going to work and coming home to your family. So it is an improvement. But the point is, the more you have to uphold a lie, the more pressure there is, and the more pressure, and the more it explodes. Now, that's not completely true. You can sort of like mitigate some of the risk in the sense of like, if you understand that you're building a pressure cooker, you could theoretically relieve some pressure. The only issue is that means you're no longer living a lie. You're acknowledging the fact that this thing's gonna blow up in my face. So you're addressing the actual issue, right? Meaning that reason has sort of caught up to you. So what do? You try to relieve some of that pressure. So let's say I had a bunch of slaves working for me. Instead of like letting it so that the pressure builds and so they try to throw a revolution, an uprising, whatever, I'd essentially make it so that I start giving them benefits, right? Maybe I just rebrand in general. If I have a bunch of slaves and they really hate me, like there's that much pressure, I just pretend I sold my farm and then have a person act in my place, a proxy if I'm not mistaken. So he's essentially the new face. He relieves some of the pressure, but I'm still making a lot of the money. So it's quite interesting. The only issue is that the more you relieve pressure, the more money you lose. So like, yeah, it can be quite complicated upholding a lie. I guess though, if we can bring it full circle, the initial idea was that the person who has the gun holds all the power. The person who has all the power essentially dictates what's true. I guess that's the wrong way to phrase it. It's not that they dictate what's true. Reason is eventually catches up. You cannot hide from the truth, right? At least not for a long time. It's just that they can temporarily uphold a lie until more pressure builds up, and then it doesn't matter that you have a gun. The point is you do not have enough bullets to kill a bunch of people. Or it just wouldn't be ideal to kill a bunch of people because then you're losing some money. But it's quite interesting because it's not completely true, but then it does hold true in the short term. It leads me into the argument of lies work in the short term, but just as easy as it is to lie, it's easy to detect the lie, making it so that what worked previously against other human beings is sort of outdated. Now, you could make the argument that you could just reinvent lies, like just keep up with the masses. But that would take an immense amount of skill, wouldn't it? But it would work, wouldn't it? If I could take it back to the original analogy, if the person with the gun holds all the power and he starts to realize that the people he's holding captive are increasing in numbers, you could just get a bigger gun. And I think that's what we see in society. We think the whole idea of like slavery is dead, but what is essentially happening is, it's not that slavery is dead; it's evolving. So evil evolves with good, making so that the dynamic just always works. Good people get smarter, forcing evil people to get even smarter and evolve. But this is the issue. It's not that much of a balance if you consider the fact that evil people are always on top. Now, there is a caveat. I think that's the right way to use that word. The caveat is the smarter good people get, the better quality of life they get. So imagine this. Good people in this instance are essentially just weak people, people who just are not smart, right? Smart enough to overcome a greater evil, so the evil subjects them to certain things, right? Bearing in mind, evil and good are sort of arbitrary here. Evil can be beneficial in this context. For example, someone that offers jobs may be seen as slavery to someone who, I don't know, wants to be free, but then it's probably seen as something beneficial to someone who just had no means of making a living, right? So, like, in this instance, the smarter good people get, good in quotation marks, the better quality of life they get. So the smarter slaves get, the more negotiating power they have. Now, it doesn't have to be smarter, it could be stronger. Well, stronger would be smarter because of if you have more numbers, you have more ideas and more thoughts, but you have more negotiating power all of a sudden, right? Forcing your slave owner, the slave master, to adapt too. So he's like, okay, I can't kill all of you because then I lose money too. I mean, I can always continue to threaten you, but at some point the dynamic won't work because of some of you guys are willing to give up your lives. So what can I do? How about I give you guys some benefits? That way we both make money, right? And they agree on that. And then eventually the slaves are like, tell the slave masters, they're like, hey, the money you're giving us is simply not enough. And then the slave master's like, okay, fine, if you work more, I'll give you more money. That sounds fair, right? And they're like, yeah. And then the slave master realizes, hey, I'm actually giving these guys way too many benefits. How can I fix this? How can I fix this? Hey, how about every time they get paid, they give me 40% of what I just gave them? Ha 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 ha. And then the slavers are like, what? That's outrageous. Then the slave masters are like, no, it's not. Why? because of healthcare is not free, right? So me taking care of you guys is not free, hence you should pay me. Or he could be much smarter and say, sorry guys, I sold this land, knowing he fully well owns the land, and unfortunately for us to keep staying here, we have to start giving away some of our income to account for this, that. I don't know, come with some bullshit. All of a sudden, he's getting his money back through a lie. Now, of course, people see through it. Of course, people are eventually like, tax is kind of a scam. In that case, just give them TV. They forget about it. They're way too comfortable. Manipulate them through radio waves or some shit like that. I'm assuming that's how TV works. I guess the topic is kind of dense, ain't it? Looking at human dynamics and power. I guess that's why it's called a dynamic, because if it's sort of like a pendulum swing. There's like, this person does this, the other person reacts in this way. This person does this, the other person reacts in this way. And that happens ad infinitum, if that's the right way to use that. But I think the idea is sort of received. Now, the question is, will the cycle ever break? And if we use correspondence as the theory of correspondence, start to realize that the cycle can't break. I mean, everything has its pair. No. Everything has its opposite, right? And if everything has its opposite, that means that... What does that mean? If everything has its opposite, that means that for quote-unquote good to exist, evil has to exist. Yeah, I think that's a separate topic, ain't it?